Good morning. For today's lecture, we're going to discuss about inflammation. Medyo lawig ni siya nga topic, so start na tayo. Inflammation is a response of vascularized tissues that delivers leukocytes and molecules of host defense from the circulation to the sites of infection and cell damage in order to eliminate the offending agents. So basically, inflammation is just a response to injury, which also includes your infection. And sabi natin, it is a response of vascularized tissues, no? So therefore, it is a response or a reaction of blood vessels that lead to accumulation of fluid and leukocytes in the extravascular tissues. Later, we're going to discuss about the 5 cardinal signs of inflammation, of acute inflammation. Inflammation destroys, dilutes, or walls off injurious agents. So we're also going to discuss about yung mga localized acute inflammation, about the body walls off acute inflammation para hindi siya kumalat, for example. And therefore, it initiates the repair process, especially yung chronic inflammation, no? And fundamentally, a protective response. Okay, ito yung main function talaga ng inflammation, a protective response. However, it may be potentially harmful. Kaya yung inflammation is some sort of a double-edged sword. So it can be a protective. However, if not limited, yung response or yung function or yung extent ng inflammation, it can be potentially harmful to us, no? For example, in cases of hypersensitivity reaction to certain external factors or external stimuli such as insect bites, drugs, contrast media in radiology, etc. And also in chronic diseases such as arthritis, atherosclerosis, disfiguring scars, yung mga keloid scars natin, visceral adhesions. Now, inflammation is simplified by 5 basic steps, no? We have ito yung 5 R's, no? Recognition, recruitment, removal, regulation, and repairs. Pag sinabi natin recognition, this is the initiating stimulus for inflammation. Ibig sabihin, pag may i-recognize muna natin kung ano yung microbes na pumasok, kung ano yung microorganism na pumasok sa katawan natin. So how does the body recognize them? Again, by cell receptors. The cell receptors also recognize these microbial products and microbes and substances released from the damaged cells. So mga cell receptors natin which is present in different parts of the cell. So pwede sila sa endosome, pwede sila sa plasma membrane, and also in the cytoplasm. For example, ito yung microbes natin and necrotic tissues. So there are receptors that will recognize them na sila ay mga offending agent or inciting agent or microbes. All right. And after recognition, there is recruitment of leukocytes. Okay, leukocytes and plasma proteins recruited from the circulation to extravascular site where the offending agent is located. So para doon sila pupunta in order for the removal of the offending agent or the injurious agent such as your microorganisms. So how are they removed, no? So they are accomplished mainly by phagocytic cells, by phagocytosis, which ingest and destroy the microbes, all right? So yan, ipophagocytose na sila ng macrophages and neutrophils. And then eventually, meron tayong regulation. So, kasi meron tayong meron mga cells that would, or mga cytokines that would limit or would amplify the inflammation. So, i-amplify yan during the initial course of inflammation, of acute inflammation, so that mas mabilis matanggal ang inciting agent, no, or offending agent. And also pag sobra-sobra na, once the inflammation has or wala na yung offending agent, of course malilimit na. There is something, a limiting factor talaga na para maiwasan ang further inflammation. So that's why there is regulation, no? Kailangan ma-terminate yung reaction when it has accomplished its purpose. Okay? And then finally, okay, yung injured tissue is replaced through regeneration of surviving cells and filling the residual defects with connective tissue or scarring. So dito na yung tissue repair natin, which will be discussed in the next lecture. All right? Okay, so ito yun, no? Recruitment. Okay, then ito yung one of the signs of your acute inflammation. So by vasodilation, later we're going to discuss about that. Then elimination or removal of the microbes. Okay, in the process, there is regulation, termination of the response kung sakaling okay na, wala na yung offending agent. And then eventually, there is extracellular matrix, ano yun, there is extracellular matrix deposition, okay, for scarring or tissue repair. Okay, so Celsus listed the 4 cardinal signs of acute inflammation, which are your rubor, tumor, calor, dolor. Okay, rubor, which means erythema or redness, is due to vasodilation or increased blood flow. So usually this is in conjunction with your calor kasi similar sila ng pathophysiology. Bakit nagkakaroon ng calor sa area of inflammation, of acute inflammation? This is due to vasodilation or due to increased blood flow. And for tumor, swelling, ibig sabihin there is extravascular accumulation of fluid and also pain, no? Imagine mo na lang pag may hubag ka sa buli, no? Okay, pag may hubag ka sa buli, 'di ba, pag hikapon mo, gabukol. So that's tumor, okay? And then pag hikap mo, medyo mainit, no? Gapula-pula. Okay, syempre pag gapula-pula, ano 'yan, medyo painful talaga 'yan, okay? So gapula-pula siya tsaka init dahil increased blood flow. Syempre ang dugo ta is mainit, 'di ba? Or warm yung dugo natin. Kaya mafi-feel natin 'yon. And si Rudolf Virchow in the 19th century added another sign of acute inflammation, which is the loss of function. Remember, loss of function is a compensatory mechanism para hindi ma-disrupt ang normal healing process, alright? Parang ano din yan eh, parang blood clot, 'di ba? Pag ano yun, pag dinidisturb yung clot formation, halimbawa lagi mo tinatanggal mo yung scab, for example, sa isang sugat, hindi talaga yan magkakaroon ng platelet plug unless tinatanggal-tanggal mo. Okay? So similar with your acute inflammation, example, may fracture, kaya kailangan siyang kinakas so that ma-immobilize siya, so that there is time for the tissues to repair itself. Now, the inflammation is caused by a variety of factors or a variety of agents. First is your infection, which can be, okay, lahat ng microorganisms, no, halos bacterial, viral, fungal, and parasitic, and not just the microbes itself, but also the products, its byproducts, the toxins na pinoproduce nila. So these are among the most common and medically important causes of inflammation. Okay, varied yung inflammatory responses natin and outcomes depending on the infectious pathogens involved, whether kung parasitic ba ito, anong mga predominant cells na nare-recruit, for example, okay? And it differs also with the pathogenicity and virulence of the microorganisms, right? Next is tissue necrosis. So not just the pwede din sa host cell, no? Kasi nare-recognize din yung mga damaged cells ng katawan, all right? So elicits inflammation regardless of cell death, which may include ischemia, reduced blood flow, trauma, physical and chemical injury, irradiation, exposure to environmental chemicals. Remember that several molecules released from necrotic cells triggers inflammation. Next is your foreign body. We have for example, splinters, dirt, or sutures. Okay, some sutures kasi are non-digestible, no? So usually sa skin na yan na part. Kaya in-advise ng surgeons na mag-follow up agad yung post-surgery kasi tatanggal yung tahi, right? Pero there are some sutures na digestible, no? So yung sa mga internal organs na yun, ng mga procedure, mga intra-abdominal surgery, right? So these foreign bodies may actually elicit inflammation themselves or because they cause traumatic tissue injury or carry microbes. So yung mga sutures kasi, however, are inert substances. So ibig sabihin hindi sila masyadong elicit ng inflammatory reaction such as yung granuloma formation. Pero however, some of the sutures actually, lalo na pag merong dirt or splinters, for example, na sugatan ka sa kahoy, no? So there will be a inflammation around the area kasi isipin ng katawan that this is a foreign substance, okay? a foreign substance, lalo yung dirt, okay? Meron tayong granuloma in the event na may pumasok na foreign bodies sa katawan. Alright? Aside from exogenous substances or foreign bodies, there are also endogenous substances that can be potentially harmful if large amounts are deposited. For example, your uric crystals, such as in gout, your cholesterol crystals and lipids, such as in xanthoma. All right, they can cause inflammation. Okay, and then fourth is your immune reaction or hypersensitivity. We're going to discuss this in the next topic na lang, no? So these are reactions in which normal protective immune system damages the individual's own tissues, autoimmune or allergies, which may be due to cytokines produced by T cells and other cells of the immune system, or even the antigen-antibody reaction. Okay, remember your hypersensitivity, the types 1 to 4. Okay, persistent and difficult to cure and often with chronic inflammation, itong immune reactions, lalo ng mga delayed type hypersensitivity. All right, so recognition of microbes, the first R, recognize. So how do we recognize microbes? By way of your cellular receptors for microbes and its products, all right? Now, as I have said earlier, that the receptors are located to different parts of the body. So it can be the plasma membrane, which will target, which will detect your extracellular microbes. Syempre, nasa surface siya nasa outside siya ng cell. So doon talaga makakatch yung mga extracellular microbes. You have also your endosomes. These are intracellular organelles. Okay, packing, storing organelles, no? And they target ingested microbes, and also for the cytoplasmic or cytosolic receptors can target intracellular microbes. Excuse me. So the cellular receptors enable cells to sense the presence of foreign invaders in any cellular compartment. Okay, usually the cellular receptors belong to a family of toll-like receptors, which is expressed in many cell types. And the engagement of these receptors trigger a production of molecules which are involved in inflammation. So merong mag-amplify, mag-modify ng cell structure, at the same time mag-amplify ng reaction by triggering the production of other molecules or other cytokines. So what are toll-like receptors? Toll-like receptors, or TLR, is the best known pattern recognition receptors. As founding member, toll was described or discovered in Drosophila. So madami tayong receptors. We have extracellular or plasma membrane. We have cytosolic and endosomal. Okay, pero itong best known is your TLRs, which can recognize the bacterial products. We also have lectin. This is part of the complement, right? Later we're going to discuss a little bit, no? And then cytosolic, no? The node-like receptors naman. All right. So other than that, syempre, yung tissue necrosis or the products of cellular damage or of host cell damage can also be the chemicals that would be sensed by the body na na kailangan siyang tanggalin sa katawan. That would trigger also inflammation. So remember that all cells have cytosolic receptors that recognize diverse set of molecules that are liberated or altered as a consequence of cell damage. So lahat ng mga intracellular components na naliliberate, na papakawalan sa circulation, secondary to cell damage, yun, pwede siyang ma-sense ng katawan. Okay, ma-sense siya ng cells or ng mga mga phagocytic cells natin. So these the byproducts that are liberated activate a multi-protein cytosolic complex known as inflammasome, which induces the production of interleukin-1. Now, interleukin-1 will trigger the recruitment of leukocytes inducing inflammation. So may mga leukocytes tayo around the area that could further improve or that further help in the inflammatory process, no? All right, so itong mga cellular damage natin, mga products of cellular damage which would act as triggers for acute inflammation include your uric acid, as I have said, gouty arthritis natin, ATP, reduced intracellular potassium concentration, and even DNA. So lahat ng mga byproducts to secondary to the cellular destruction. So can be triggers for inflammation. Now there are cases when there is gain of function mutation sensors, which causes auto-inflammatory syndromes. So remember kasi yung sabi natin yung inflammasome can induce the production of IL-1, which will further recruit the WBC towards the site of inflammation. Therefore, pag madami tayong interleukin-1, so mas madami marirecruit mga leukocytes, mas madami or mas intense yung inflammatory reaction. So that's why in cases of ang may problema dito sa sensors of cell damage natin, which can cause an autoinflammatory syndrome in which the inflammation is so extensive, no? That's why meron mga drugs such as known as interleukin-1 antagonist is helpful para ma-prevent niya itong production ng IL-1 or interleukin-1 so that no more recruitment of leukocytes toward the site of inflammation. Now, there are other cellular receptors involved in inflammation. So we have the receptors for the FC. Okay, FC region ng antibody natin, all right? Remember your antibody, the structure antibody. We have the Fab region, which will attach to the epitope of your antigen or your pathogen, right? And then the FC receptor, ito yung magbabind dito, no? Magbabind yung FC receptor dito sa FC receptor, FC tail ng antibodies natin, all right? In the sense or in the process of opsonization, so i-coat yung bacteria para mabilis siya, easily digestible or easily recognized by your macrophage. There are also circulating proteins known as your mannose binding lectin. It will recognize the microbial sugars and promotes ingestion of microbes and activation of the complement system. So ito yung sa lectin pathway. So for example, itong Staphylococcus aureus, na-identify ng katawan the microbial sugar, so it will be tagged by your mannose binding lectin, which will then activate the lectin pathway of your complement system activation. Aside from the MBL, we also have colectins, which can also bind and combat microbes. Now, with regards to the temporal properties of inflammation, it can be divided into two. We have the acute and chronic inflammation. So for the onset, acute inflammation is fast. It can occur in minutes or hours compared to your chronic, which is usually days and sometimes months, years then, okay? And then for the cellular infiltrate, of course, for the acute inflammation, yung mga first or mga frontliners talaga is mainly neutrophil. Okay, yung mga neutrophils talaga yun. And for the chronic, yung mga mononuclears naman, okay, monocytes, macrophages, and lymphocytes. And with regards to tissue injury and fibrosis, usually kasi pag acute inflammation, syempre very fast yan. So this is usually mild and self-limited kasi nga mabilis nga lang, no wall off agad. And pag sinabi natin fibrosis, this is laying down of collagen, no? Magde-deposit ng extracellular matrix. This is more of a tissue repair, no? So in the long run, sa chronic inflammation siya. Okay? Kasi yung yung acute inflammation, one of the fates ng acute inflammation is the pwedeng resolution or can progress into a chronic inflammation or can result also to fibrosis, all right? So that's more on the chronic yan, progressive siya, yung fibrosis and tissue injury in chronic inflammation. And for the local and systemic signs, remember the 5 cardinal signs of acute inflammation. Ano yan? Prominence acute inflammation. Sa chronic, hindi na. Alright? So ito yung just an overview, no? Again, sa review natin. Acute inflammation, short duration, there is edema and other signs of systemic signs of inflammation, okay? Such as fever, etc. And mainly neutrophils yung ano natin, yung defender, yung fighter natin during the initial phase of acute inflammation. In contrast, chronic inflammation is longer in duration and predominantly lymphocyte and macrophage or mononuclears are nagpe-predominate in this kind of inflammation. And there is fibrosis and also angiogenesis, no? Or new vessel formation. Now, granulomatous inflammation is a distinctive part or pattern of chronic inflammation in which activated macrophages predominate or yung epithelioid cells natin. Remember that granulomatous inflammation, pwede siyang case-shaping or non-case-shaping. Pag sinabi natin case-shaping granulomatous inflammation, the prototype granulomatous inflammation with caseation necrosis is short tuberculosis, in which meron tayong Langhans type multinucleated giant cells. Okay, so mga non-case-shaping granuloma naman, they can form multinucleated giant cells din, and also your foreign body granuloma. Okay, it's also considered as a granulomatous inflammation. However, yung sinabi kong the prototype for case-shaping, may caseation necrosis ng granulomatous inflammation is tuberculosis. Now we go to acute inflammation. No? Three major components of acute inflammation include, number one, increase in blood flow, which will cause your redness and warmth, the two cardinal signs of inflammation. And we also have edema, results from increased hydrostatic pressure, vasodilation, lowered intravascular osmotic pressure, which will cause protein leakage. And leukocytes immigrate from circulation and accumulate into the focus of injury. So the mga stimuli natin for acute inflammation, so we have infection, trauma, physical and chemical agents, foreign bodies, immune reactions, as we have discussed earlier. All right, so this is the blood vessel reaction. So normally, the hydrostatic pressure and the colloid osmotic pressure is in a balance, no? In a balance so that walang net outflow or inflow of fluid within the circulation and into the interstitium. Now, pag sinabi nating transudate, so there is increase either of hydrostatic pressure secondary to outflow obstruction, such as congestive heart failure. Okay, imaginein mo ba, may venous outflow obstruction, may host dyan. Okay, so increase, may stasis of flow, may pressure pa din, so medyo lolobo yung vessel natin, and eventually meron mga leakage dyan ng fluids, no, from the vessel to the outside, to the interstitial tissues. And also, when there is decreased colloid osmotic pressure, ano yan, it will also cause the leakage of the fluids, of the water. Kasi ibig sabihin, equilibrate yan ng katawan, no? For example, itong mga, halimbawa ito yung normal, no? Yung mga bilog na yan, normal number of plasma proteins, and each one has a partner of water, for example, to give you a clearer paano nangyari yun, okay? So for example, pag wala ng plasma proteins, konti na yung plasma proteins. So konti yung plasma proteins, pero yung space dito is madami. So madaming, let's say, madaming water molecules dyan compared sa normal na ratio. For example, no, 1:1. Ito parang konti na lang, no? Pero mas madaming water. So ibig sabihin gustong i-equilibrate ng katawan. So anong gagawin niya? Para konti din yung water, para maging 1:1 na sila, isang molecule ng plasma protein, isang molecule ng water, for example, right? So anong gagawin is that the fluid will leak out, or mga water molecules lalabas, so that same na ulit sila ng ratio. Okay, so ang ending nito is magkakaroon ng edema kasi the fluid will leak towards the interstitium, the interstitial tissue. All right? Now, for exudate naman, so from the word is exudation. So actually, it's basically secondary inflammation, no? It's either vasodilation and stasis and increase interendothelial spaces. So pag increase yung interendothelial spaces, now proteins and cells can leak out of the blood vessels, right? So ito yun, no? Plasma proteins. By the way, anong hydrostatic pressure? The pressure of the fluid within the capillary wall or within the vessel wall, while your colloid osmotic pressure is the pressure of plasma cells exerted by the colloid osmotic pressure is the pressure exerted by your plasma proteins. Majority is albumin. All right, so it will draw water towards the intravascular space. Now, in acute inflammation, there are changes in vascular flow and caliber. First is vasodilation. Pag sinabing vasodilation, malaki yung caliber ng blood vessels natin. So it is mediated by histamine, and it is one of the areas manifestation of acute inflammation. It results in increased blood flow, which will cause the heat and redness or erythema at the site of inflammation, as I have said earlier. Right? This is the intact, the normal blood vessel, no? So all cellular components and plasma proteins are contained within the vessel. So this is the endothelium, simple squamous epithelium. And this is the tissues, interstitial tissues. Now, increased vascular permeability naman will result to outpouring of protein-rich fluid into the extravascular space. Since meron na tayong interendothelial spaces or retraction of endothelial cells, so that meron ng siwang or meron ng space or meron ng gap, so that the proteins and the cells can leak out of the vasculature. And also with stasis, no, engorgement of small vessels with slow-moving red cells. Remember, pag sinabi mo stasis, ano yan? Sluggish yung flow ng blood. Okay, this is seen in vascular congestion and localized redness. All right, neutrophils accumulate along the vascular endothelium as soon afterward they migrate through the vascular wall and into the interstitial tissue. So ito yung yan, pag mag-retract yung endothelial cells natin, the cells and the plasma proteins can leak out. All right, so as I've said, ito na yun, no? So can occur rapidly. Exposure to the mediator is usually short-lived, around 15 to 30 minutes. And for last, no, yung endothelial injury can be due to a number of factors, lalo na yung severe physical injuries such as thermal burns or sunburn. Okay, so endothelial cell necrosis and detachment. So they may detach. Endothelial may be detached and therefore making the blood vessel permeable. Okay, so pwede nang maka-freely go in and out yung plasma proteins and even the cells. Right? So we are done with recognition na, no? So next we go to the recruitment na. Okay, tatawag na tayo kung sino yung papasok natin or isasabak natin sa laban. Remember that the initial changes of blood flow and vascular permeability quickly followed by the influx of leukocytes in the tissue. All right? So yung predominant leukocytes natin, the site of inflammation or typical of inflammatory reaction are your neutrophils and macrophages. So here is the macrophage and your neutrophil. So multilobated siya, tapos by a thin filament of chromatin lang. All right? And then yan, lymphocytes and your macrophage. All right. Leukocytes are also produce growth factors that aid in repair. So aside from that, aside from the interleukin, they also produce growth factors that aid in repair. So that continuum ba siya from acute inflammation to chronic inflammation to repair or to tissue repair. All right. When strongly activated, leukocytes may induce tissue damage and prolong inflammation. Now, ito yung sinasabi ko na it needs to be regulated kasi propagation or prolongation of acute inflammation could cause more harm to the host. Okay, kaya kailangan i-limit ito. So there are mechanisms in which the inflammation can be limited. No, there are certain mediators that will limit or will trigger a stop in the acute inflammation. So the journey of leukocytes from the vessel lumen to the tissue is a multi-step process that is mediated and controlled by adhesion molecules and cytokines called chemokines. So this process can be divided in 3 sequential steps depende sa site kung saan siya, whether intravascularly or extracellularly or along the endothelial lining. All right. So in the lumen, there is the margination, rolling, and adhesion to endothelium occurs in the lumen, intravascular. So nandun nangyayari before sila lalabas. Okay, meron sila magpila muna sila, tapos magligid-ligid, and then magdikit-dikit. All right? Then migration across the endothelium, or it's yung transmigration or diapedesis. And then eventually migration tissues toward the site of chemotactic stimulus. So first, for the leukocyte addition to endothelium, early in inflammation, syempre pag sa start pa lang, sabi natin there is stasis or slowing of blood flow. Now the hemodynamic conditions change. Yung wall shear stress decreases. Ito yung parang thin line along the walls of the blood vessel, no? So madi-disrupt yun. And at the same time, imagine mo ba sa isa ka room tapos madami ka muda kasi sirado na yung perdahan. So gasulod ang mga tao pero wala silang output or wala silang alagyan. So mangyayari is that maglilinya-linya sila. So similar with your leukocytes, maglilinya-linya sila yan sa area na wala masyadong sluggish yung flow ng blood. Pag maglinya-linya sila, doon na talaga Yun yung margination natin, no? Mag-redistribute yung leukocyte. And then subsequently, the leukocytes will undergo rolling and eventually adhesion. Ito na yung firmer interaction, no? Ng leukocytes with the endothelial cells or with the endothelium, all right? So this is mediated by adhesion molecules. Remember this one, no? The selectins and ligands used for initial rolling. So ito yung medyo weak pa lang kasi nagmo-move pa ang leukocytes natin, which will eventually become firm or made strong by your integrins, no? Ito na talaga siya sa adhesion. So here are your endothelial leukocyte adhesion molecules. Remember that the E, P, and the CD31 present in your endothelium. The rest, mostly mononuclear cells, macrophages or monocytes, and your T cells. Alright, so different parts ito sila, pwede silang different parts of tawag dito or steps of process ng leukocytes, no, from diapidesis or from margination towards the chemotaxis. Next is leukocyte adhesion. It is the next step in the process of leukocyte recruitment. Is migration of leukocytes through the endothelium. So ito na ngayon yung transmigration or diapidesis. So this is brought about by your CD31 or PCAM1. So later in the picture, I'm going to show you kung paano lumalabas yung neutrophils natin across the blood vessels, all right? Or next is your chemotaxis of leukocytes. So after sila mag-pass through the endothelial cells, they move towards the site of chemotaxin or the chemoattractant. Now, chemoattractant can be exogenous or endogenous. Pag sinabi na exogenous, this is extracellularly, and they can be found in the bacterial products, most especially yung mga bacterial products with the peptides containing this substance, no, or amino acid terminal, the N-formylmethionine, okay, and also some lipids. While your endogenous chemoattractant, so these are produced by the cells during the acute inflammatory process or the inflammatory process. We have the cytokines, components of the complement system, particularly C5a, arachidonic acid metabolates, mainly leukotriene B4. Now, ito yung picture natin ng scanning electron microscope, no? So this is actually, believe it or not, this is a macrophage, okay, or a phagocytic cell. So meron siya mga extensions, cytoplasmic extensions. These are your philopodia. You can see it here, mas slender and mas pointed. While your lamellopedia or lamellipodia, ito yung mga cytoskeletal extension. Okay, so remember that the net result leukocyte migrate toward the stimulus in the direction of the locally produced chemoattractants. So meron tayong, ito yung leading edge, ito yung lagging edge. So ito, or trailing edge. So itong part na to, ito yung talaga mag-scavenge for microbes or substance to be swallowed, no? So yan, kaya actually this is a reaction, itong movement ng phagocytic cell is actually triggered by G-coupled protein. G-protein coupled interaction, no, which will cause a conformational change of the phagocytic cell, which includes the cytoskeletal mga myosin and actin. All right. Next is the once leukocytes, particularly neutrophils and monocytes, have been recruited to the site of inflammation or infection or cell death, they must be activated to perform their function. So again, this is done so by the recognition of the offending agents by the toll-like receptors and other receptors, and will also activate leukocytes phagocytose and dispose or destroy the offending agents. Okay. So ito more on the acute inflammation, no? Kasi you can see it here, the neutrophils, no? Although a few, meron tayong mga component, ng mild component ng acute ng chronic inflammation. However, this side we have the chronic inflammation, no? Mga mononuclears ito, so more on acute, more on chronic inflammation ito. Siya, all right? So this table naman, ito yung initial, no, activity na so increase yung edema mga around Yan, kung days ito, number of days, first day, second day, third day. So mga around half a day, no? Pwede siya mag-edema. And then eventually follow your neutrophils, and then lastly, your monocytes phagocytic system. I have mentioned this already, no? Extravasation or transmigration, all right, can be due to the following, no? Or delivery of leukocytes in the lumen, as I have said earlier, margination, rolling, adhesion, migration across the endothelium, diabetes, and migration to interstitial tissue by means of chemotaxis. All right. So leukocyte ingest offending agents, phagocytosis, kill microbes, degrading necrotic tissue, and foreign antigens. And it should be a balance between the helpful and harmful effects of extravasated leukocytes. Now, this is the picture of this is the picture of how the leukocyte is recruited towards the site of inflammation. No? So first, there is margination, no? Lalo na pag may stasis, no? The shear wall stress is affected, no? Hindi na siya ganun kaganda or hindi na siya, kasi parang plain lang kasi yun. I mean, kung parang flavor ba, yun na yun, alright? So margination and then rolling, again, as I have said, we have P-selectin, E-selectin, and PCAM or CD31 present in your endothelium. All right? And then rolling, selectins, and then pagdating na adhesion, more on the antibody na. Okay? Okay. Or more on the, ano na siya, more on the integrins na pala, sorry. Integrins na, all right? And then eventually your PCAM and CD31, okay, will cause the transmigration of the leukocytes. And then pag nag-transmigrate na siya outside the vessel, then it will go to the site of injury via chemokines or yung mga cytokines natin. So this is another picture, no? So leukocyte rolling, okay, and then integrins, all right, and then stable adhesion and eventually migration. All right. So this is the neutrophils, no? Remember the neutrophil is multi-lobe, so 3 to 5 lobes actually. So pag greater than 5, so that signifies ano lang yan, nuclear, may asynchrony in the maturation of the nucleus, no? So pwede siyang vitamin B12 deficiency. So around 3 to 5 lobes connected by a thin filament lang, ano? And this is eosinophil, no? This is not this is not the acute and inflammation ba? Kasi more on eosinophil is more on the parasitic infection, right? All right. Now, this is leukocyte margination. So ito yung sabi ko, nagapila-pila sila, no, before sila papasok sa door. Okay, kailangan magpilahay. Kung minsan nag-stampede yung mga ano din, mga leukocytes natin within the vessel. And then this is diapedesis. Again, ano yung responsible or ano yung assist natin doon for the diapedesis. Again, your PCAM or CD31, right? Next is your sequence of leukocyte migration. Neutrophils predominate around 6 to 24 hours, while your monocytes in the next 24 to 48 hours. And induction activation of different additional molecular pairs and specific chemotactic factors in different phases of inflammation. All right. So next is your recognition of microbes or dead cells induced by several responses. Ano na tayo in leukocyte that are collectively called leukocyte activation. So ito yung ano yan, how the body will recognize and destroy the cell or the microbe. All right. So phagocytosis involves 3 sequential steps. We have the recognition, and attachment of particle to be ingested. Next, engulfment with subsequent formation of phagocytic vacuole, killing or degradation of the ingested material. Kasi yung phagocytic or phagosome will join with the lysosome. So basically, ganun yung pairing natin. All right. So next is killing of degradation of the ingested material. Okay, so this is a picture of your cell membrane, no? So remember that with recognition of microbes, you have different cell receptors that would sense or would detect the microbes present or the microbes making contact with the cell. All right, and then the cellular response will yield to a series of G-coupled proteins or G-protein coupled reactions, no? So by cytoskeletal changes or signal transduction, etc. So yon. And then next, ano ba? Functional outcomes will result into increased integrin avidity, addition to endothelium, migration in tissues, amplification of inflammatory reaction, microbicidal activity of leukocytes. So yung response nila is more of a cycle, no? So merong mag-migrate into tissues, merong mag-adhere sa endothelium. So parang a process rolled into one or several process ba rolled into one, no? Nandun lahat. All right? So phagocytosis involves the phagocytic receptors, which include your mannose receptors, scavenger receptors, and receptors for various opsonins. So here are the phagocytic receptors present, no? Mannose receptors. So ito yung sa MBLs natin, sa mga lectins, no? Mannose binding lectin. So magbabind sila sa mannose receptors. And for scavenger receptors, we have ano yan, the microbes can also bind to it, and also as or in addition to your modified LDL particles. All right, so next is your opsonic receptor. So high affinity opsonins such as IgG, C3b mannose binding lectin can bind to your opsonins, right? Now, ano na pala tayo, phagocytosis, no? So tapos na tayo sa recruitment, tapos tayo sa recognition, recruitment. This one is a removal na. Okay, phagocytosis and clearing of the offending agent. All right, so intracellular destruction of microbes and debris. Remember that killing of microbes is accomplished by, ganun pa din, no? By reactive oxygen species or ROS. But also, aside from that, meron din tayong reactive nitrogen species, mainly derived from nitric oxide, and these cells, these as well as the lysosomal enzymes destroy also phagocytosed debris. And remember that the clearing of the offending agent or the removal of the offending agent, the injurious stimuli, is actually the final step of elimination of infectious agents. So we have intracellular destruction of microbes and debris. We have ROS. Okay, this is produced rapidly by the assembly and activation of multi-component oxidase known as your NADPH oxidase. NADPH oxidase will oxidize the NADPH and in the process reduces oxygen to superoxide anion, which is actually a respiratory burst in neutrophils. So ito yung defense mechanism ng neutrophils natin against phagocytosed bacteria or phagocytosed substances. ROS are produced within the lysosome and phagolysosome. Remember that. Nasa loob siya. Okay, para malimit din yung effects niya, no? All right. Where they act on ingest particles without damaging the host cell, right? And then we also have another system of how we handle inflammatory reaction or acute inflammation. We have the hydrogen peroxide NPO halide system. This is the most efficient bactericidal system in neutrophils. Remember that the NPO is the present in the primary granules or azurophilic granules of your neutrophils. So they bind to and modify cellular lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, and thereby destroying the microbes. Next is your antioxidants to protect host cells. Remember that no amount of Pampa Beauty ba? Okay? There's no amount of Pampa Beauty, antioxidants ba? Iniisip ko yung mga beauty products ba, ganun, to protect host cells, because we also have systems that would actually prevent the formation or accumulation of your reactive oxygen species, and these are the enzyme system, no? We have the superoxide dismutase, catalase, glutathione, ceruloplasmin, and transferrin. Okay, your nitric oxide, it is a soluble gas from arginine by the action of nitric acid synthase or NOS, which participates in microbial cleaning of killing. So out of the three NOS, it is the inducible or NOS or INOS is involved in microbial killing. Okay, and it is also induced when macrophages and neutrophils are activated by cytokines or microbial products. So aside from the iNOS, we have the eNOS or the endothelial NOS, which will maintain which will maintain the caliber of the vessel or the vascular tone, right? And then your neuronal NOS is a neurotransmitter. Okay. Remember that in macrophages, NO reacts with superoxide to generate the highly reactive free radical peroxynitrate, which will damage the lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and microbes. So in generally, yung peroxynitrate is a potent potent killer of microbes. So neutrophils and monocytes contain lysosomal granules which contribute to microbial cleaning. Cleaning ako ng killing, okay? Anyway, kasi cleaning, nasasabi ko kasi nga, phagocytosis clearance. So, i-clean yung system, no? I-clean of the microbes. So, parang technical speaking, correct pa din naman yung microbial clearing or cleaning, ganun, right? So, neutrophil granules is composed of two granules, no? We have the azurophilic and the specific azurophilic or primary granules, and the secondary or specific granules. All right, so ito yung mga contents nila. Okay, for the specific granules, lysozyme, collagenase, gelatinase, lactoferrin, plasminogen activator, histamine, alkaline phosphatase. While your azurophilic granules, so ito yung mga non-specific lang, no? MPO, bactericidal factors, lysozyme, defensin, hydrolases, and neutral processes such as proteases such as your elastase, cathepsin G, collagenases, and proteinase 3. All right. So other microbicidal granule contents include the following: defensins, arginine-rich granule peptides, catalycidins, lysozyme, lactoferrin, and major basic protein, which is present predominantly in your account. Huh? Oo. All right. So major basic protein in eosinophils. Remember this one, guys. The major basic protein in eosinophils. We have such term as the neutrophil extracellular traps. So what are neutrophil extracellular traps? These are fibril networks that provide a high concentration of antimicrobial substances at sites of infection, and they prevent the spread of microbes by trapping them in fibrils. So this consists of various meshwork of nuclear chromatin that binds and concentrates granule proteins such as antimicrobial peptides and enzymes. So parang ano siya, parang sieve ba siya or salaan, no? It will trap all the microbes that would pass or to a certain area within the vasculature or within the tissue, all right? So ito yun, no? Neutrophil activation, okay? So magkakaroon ng nuclear translocation of granular enzymes, and then the chromatin will decondensate and break down into internal membranes. And again, yan, mag-form na siya ng nets or neutrophil extracellular traps, which will actually literally trap the bacteria in the process or in the meshwork. Leukocyte-mediated tissue injury, again, as I have said, no, inflammation is a double-edged sword. No, it can be beneficial and potentially harmful. So there are cases in which the leukocytes may cause injury to normal cells and tissues under several circumstances. Number one is that when adjacent tissues suffer collateral damage. So again, parang ano lang yan, parang bahay ba na magkadikit-dikit, for example, no? So nasunog ang bahay ng isa, tapos hindi na wall off yung sunog, and it propagate to the other house, and then eventually pag hindi talaga na natupok yung fire, it will extensive na yung damage, kumbaga. Alright, just like this one, no, collateral damage. Next is when inflammatory response is inappropriately directed against host tissues such as your autoimmune diseases. Okay, remember autoimmune diseases. So it affects or wala na tayong self-tolerance of the antigens, no? So na-infect or ina-attack yung self-antigen natin. Autoimmune, okay? And then third, when host reacts excessively against usually harmless environmental substances such as your mga allergens natin in allergic diseases including asthma. All right? And aside from the functions mentioned earlier, so activated leukocytes also produce cytokines that can either amplify or limit the inflammatory reactions. So ito yung one of the regulatory measures ng katawan natin on how to stop at least the inflammation kung sakaling tapos na. Alright? Aside from that, as I have mentioned kanina, no, so ito yung ROS, we have also that reactive nitrogen species. Okay. So other functional responses of activated leukocytes. Okay, so tapos tayo sa recruitment, tapos sa recognition, recruitment, removal. Now we go to the regulation. Okay, the fourth R. So termination of acute inflammatory response. Remember that hindi pwede yung inflammation can go on and on. Okay, inflammation actually declines after the offending agents are removed. So whenever the offending agents are successfully removed by the body, again the inflammation will stop then. Kasi wala naman wala na yung agents na panlalabanan natin, alright? And then neutrophils also have short half-lives in tissue and they die by apoptosis within a few hours after leaving the blood. So once the neutrophils which can actually secrete then ng mga more cytokines, so wala na kasi nga namatay na din sila or namatay na din yung neutrophils. And then the process itself triggers a variety of stop signals that actively terminate the reaction. Now we have mediators of inflammation. So sa regulation of the inflammation is actually done by the mediators of inflammation. So mediators can either be secreted by cells or generated from the plasma proteins. So remember this guys, active mediators are produced only in response to a various stimuli. So different stimuli, different din yung mediators natin. Kasi whether, for example, parasitic infection, okay, parasitic infection, viral infection. So different cells or different mediators are involved, okay? But the one thing is for sure, no one mediator can stimulate the release of other mediators. Kumbaga nag-amplify siya. So one cytokine will also activate another cytokine, and one cytokine will stimulate another mediator. All right. Now here are the principal mediators of inflammation. All right, we have, basahin niyo na lang ito guys ha. Okay, anyway, I will just post pointers now, right? Now we go to mediators of inflammation. First, we have the vasoactive amines. We have the histamine and serotonin. So remember that histamine is actually richest source niya is from the mast cell and basophil. Remember, basophil is from the intravascular or sa blood natin pag nasa tissues ng mast cell. Okay, so preformed histamine is degranulated due to a variety of stimuli. So ito yung mga stimuli natin kanina. Alright, yung physical injury, pwede yun. Or sometimes products of complement such as your CT&C5, your anaphylatoxins, your neuropeptide cytokines din. Okay, and histamine causes dilatation of arterioles and increases permeability of the venules. Okay, and next is your serotonin. In contrast to your histamine, which is a vasodilator, serotonin is a vasoconstrictor. However, its primary function is more on the brain. Huh? All right. Neuropeptides, okay, substance P, or neurotransmitter in the GI tract. Remember yung autonomous nervous system natin, right? Okay, sympathetic and parasympathetic. All right. So next is your arachidonic acid metabolites. We have the AA. AA is a 20 carbon polyunsaturated fatty acid that is derived from dietary sources or by conversion from the essential fatty acid linoleic acid. All right. And then they are derived yung eicosanoids or yung derivatives ng arachidonic acid are synthesized or produced by two major classes of enzymes named as your COX and lipoxegenases. COX or cyclooxygenases, which will generate your prostaglandins, including prostacyclins doon, right? And lipoxegenases, which will produce your leukotrienes and your lipoxenes. So ito yung diagram natin of how the arachidonic acid derivatives are affected or are produced. All right. So from the cell membrane phospholipids, we have phospholipases acted upon by the phospholipase A2. Okay, so which will produce your arachidonic acid. Now, arachidonic acid will further be be acted upon by two major enzymes such as your cyclooxygenase and lipoxygenase, right? The cyclooxygenase will give rise to your prostaglandins, while your lipoxygenase will give rise to your leukotrienes and your lipoxenes. Okay, first is your prostaglandins. Prostaglandin is produced by your mast cells and macrophages, endothelial cells, and many other cell types. And again, generated by two types of cyclooxygenases or COX. We have the COX-1 and the COX-2. Ano yung COX-1? COX-1 is primarily inflammatory and homeostatic functions, while COX-2 is more on inflammatory only, or inflammatory actions lang siya. Remember that there are pharmaceutical products that are specific for COX-2 only, which is actually good, no? Kasi nga more on the inflammation lang talaga yung ano niya, yung ano tawag dito, yung target niya, unlike your COX-1, which will also inhibit inflammatory at the same time yung homeostatic functions ng katawan. So here are the important prostaglandins in inflammation. We have thromboxane A2, prostacyclin, and prostaglandins. All right? Just read on this. Magbigay na lang ako ng pointers. Okay. Next, leukotrienes. Again, this is produced by your from arachidonic acid by the action of your lipoxygenase. All right. Remember, this is the more potent than histamine, increasing vascular permeability and thereby causing bronchospasms. Remember that yung yung leukotrienes natin has a role in your bronchospasm, yung mga asthma natin. Kaya meron tayong mga pharmacologic agents yan, mga Montelukast, right? So LTB4, remember LTB4, no? This is a potent chemotactic agent and activator of neutrophils, causing aggregation, adhesion of the cells to endothelium and generation of ROS, and also release of lysosomal enzymes. While the rest of the leukotrienes, C, D, E, will cause intense vasoconstriction, bronchospasm, important in asthma, and increased permeability of veins. Next, your lipoxenes, which are generated from arachidonic acid by lipoxygenase pathway. They suppress inflammation by inhibiting the recruitment of leukocytes, neutrophil, chemotaxis, and adhesion to endothelium. Okay. Usually, 2-cell population are required for transcellular biosynthesis of these mediators. Neutrophils produce intermediate lipoxine synthesis, and these are converted to lipoxygens by platelets interacting with the leukocyte. So, dalawa sila, neutrophils at the same time platelets. All right. Now, ito yung sinasabi ko kanina, no? Pharmacologic inhibitors. There are COX inhibitors that inhibits the COX-1 and the COX-2. The COX-2 or selective COX-2 inhibitors are newer class of drugs na anti-inflammatory, which are better kasi nga inflammatory lang talaga yung mode of action nila, ini-inhibit nila yung COX-2. Alright? So yung COX-1, both COX-1 and COX-2 naman, ito yung mga non-specific pa such as your aspirin and your ibuprofen or yung Alaxan Forte. Sakit-sakit ang muscle, di ba? Next is your lipoxygenase inhibitors, corticosteroids, leukotriene receptor antagonists. Alright? Yan, ito yung example natin ng leukotriene receptor antagonists such as Montelukast, useful in treatment of asthma. Alright? While your corticosteroids, sa start pa lang, no? Sa start ng production of eicosanoids or production of arachidonic acid metabolites. So sa taas ng pathway, so corticosteroids dun siya sa pinakataas. Next is your cytokines. What are your cytokines? Cytokines are proteins produced by many cell types, principally activated lymphocytes, macrophages, and dendritic cell, but also ibang cells can also produce them. Okay, they mediate and regulate immune and inflammatory reactions. So here are the major principal cytokines or cytokines in the body. All right, remember TNF1. Majority actually of these cytokines are produced by your macrophages, your activated macrophages, and your T cells, mga mononuclears. Okay, so these are present in your acute inflammation, and remember these guys, the TNF and IL-1. Okay, sabi natin, TNF IL-1 will similar to tumor necrosis factor, greater role in fever. Okay, and also remember, di ba sila yung responsible for the recruitment of the recruitment of more leukocytes towards the site of injury. Okay, tumor necrosis factor and interleukin-1, IL-1, they have critical roles in leukocyte recruitment by promoting addition of leukocytes to endothelium and then migration through the blood vessels. Remember that these substances or these cytokines are mainly produced by your activated macrophages and dendritic cells. Right? TNF is also produced by T cells and mast cells, and IL-1, aside from the activated macrophages, some epithelial cells can also produce IL-1, right? And again, these cytokines are stimulated, or the cells or the activated, for example, activated macrophages are stimulated to produce these cytokines, okay, by the following triggers, no? Pwedeng microbial products, immune complex, foreign bodies, and any form of injury. All right, so the most important roles of these cytokines are your endothelial cell activation of leukocytes to other cells, and systemic acute phase reactants such as your fever and cachexia, okay, tumor necrosis factor, and interleukin-1. All right. Next is your chemokines. What are chemokines? Chemokines are a family of small proteins, 8 to 10 kilodaltons, that act primarily as chemoattractants for a specific type of leukocytes. So there are 4 major groups of chemokines, no, according to the arrangement of sustained residues in the proteins. So we have the CXC chemokines, CC chemokines, C chemokines, CX3, C chemokines. Chemokines, ano sila, they mediate their activities by binding to G protein coupled receptors. So that will, that will trigger a series or a cascade of transcriptional changes which causes the conformational changes within the cell. Okay, the cytoskeleton most especially, all right, para may movement, okay, may movement and may engulfment or may phagocytosis na mangyayari. And here are your different chemokines, no? So yan, very magpamilya na lang kayo sa other name niya, such as or under that, no, kung ano ba siya. Is it a C chemokines, etc. So lymphotaxin, specific for lymphocytes, fractalkine, all right, yeah, CX3C chemokines. Okay, so what are the 2 main functions of your chemokines? So they can be in acute inflammation. Inflammatory chemokines are the ones whose production is induced by your microbes and other stimuli. While for the maintenance of tissue architecture, pwede din siya. So homeostatic chemokines organize various cell types in different anatomic regions of the cells or of the tissues, such as your both the B and T cells, no, and in discrete areas of the spleen and lymph node. So nagme-maintain din pala yung chemokines with regards to the tissue architecture natin. Okay, next is your complement system. So remember that the cleavage of C3 can occur by one of 3 pathways. So tatlo yung basically yung complement system activation. We have the classical pathway, which is triggered by fixation of C1 to antibody. Okay. IgM and IgG that has combined with the antigen. So yung antigen antibody na combined with the antigen, ano na? Yung antibody IgM IgG na merong antigen, okay, it will be tagged by the body na, hoy, ano yan, kakainin natin yan, ganon, alright? Pero kailangan na niyang mag-bind yung mag-fix ang C1 sa kanya so that ma-activate or mag-cleave agad yung C3, okay, para makapag-form tayo further ng another convertase, no? C5 convertase. Later, I'm going to show you the picture. Next is your alternative pathway, which is triggered by microbial surface molecules, all right? So this can be an endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide or complex polysaccharides, cobravinum, other substances in the absence of antibody. So hindi ito kailangan ng antibody. Just the microbial surface molecules will again activate. So similar sila ng pathway, no, towards the C3 cleavage of C3. Your lectin pathway, on the other hand, which is mayroon tayong MBL kanina, di ba? Mannose binding lectin, which will bind to the sugars or the carbohydrates on microbes, i-detect nila. All right. So yun. Okay, so what are complements? Okay, this complement system is a collection of soluble proteins and membrane receptors that function mainly in the host defense against microbes and in pathologic inflammatory reactions. Right. So complement system functions in both innate and adaptive immunity for defense against microbial pathogens. So the critical step in complement activation is the proteolysis of the third and the most abundant component, which is your C3. Okay, so here's the diagram of the pathway. All right, parehas sila ng lectin, an alternative pathway, wala silang no requirement for antibody or immune complex, no? It's the classical pathway lang. However, in contrast to your alternative pathway, the classical lectin pathway parang seems to have same ba, C3 convertase ang mapoproduce niya, okay? By the binding of C4b and C2a, all right? Magiging C3 convertase. And then your C3 convertase will further cleave your C3 into C3A and C3B. Okay, ito yun. Okay. Pero itong alternative pathway will go directly to the cleavage of your C3 and C3B. So dito na sila mag-merge. Alright, and then eventually, meron tayong C5 convertase. Ito yung component natin, yung C3BB, BB, C3BB, C3BB, C3B, alright? Or C4B, C2, A, C3B. So naka-combine lang yan sila. Alright? Dagdag ka lang ng C3B. Okay, and then eventually, okay, C3B natin will also bind to C6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay, to form your membrane attack complex, which will cause the eventual lysis of the microbes. So the main function of your complement system is the inflammation. So can be anaphylatoxins such as C3A, 4A, and 5A, chemotoxic agent, 5A, lipoxenes activator, C5A, and then opsonization phagocytosis. So is the C3B and I-C3B or inactive C3B. And cell lysis, yun yan, sinabi ko earlier, membrane attack complex. All right, so there are regulators also with the complement system. The first is the C1 inhibitor, no? It blocks the activation of C1. And inherited disorder of this causing deficiency of this regulator can cause hereditary angioedema. Next is we have the decay accelerating factor and CD59. So these are actually two proteins that are linked to plasma membranes by the glycophosphatidylcholine or glycophosphatidylcholine anchor or the GPI. All right. So the decay accelerating factor prevents the formation of C3 convertases and CD49. And therefore, it is implicated, a deficiency in this one is implicated in paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria. Okay, remember that one, guys. So other mediators include the platelet activating factor, products of coagulation, the kinins, and neuropeptides. Remember, there is a pathway ba or parang meron tayong connection between the coagulation and the inflammation by way of your kinins, of your kininogens. All right. So here are the major roles of the mediators in different reactions of inflammation. Remember that vasodilation occurs in this, ano yan, vasodilation is brought about by your histamine and prostaglandins as the principal or the main mediators. Okay, you just read in this, guys. Remember fever, IL-1, and TNF. Although, pwede din siyang prostaglandins. And now for the pain naman is prostaglandins and bradykinin. So remember bradykinin or bradykinin pag arte-arte. Okay, so there are different morphologic patterns of acute inflammation. So we have 4, no? First is the serous inflammation. Later, I'm going to show you pictures. Serous inflammation, which involves the outpouring of thin fluids, such as serous effusion of blisters. Fibrous inflammation, which is more present in the body cavity. So whether pleural, pericardial, ganon. So leakage of fibrin may lead to scar tissue kasi nga fibrinous na siya. So it will ano ba? It will be a good training ground na maging ano siya, parang yun, addition niya or scar tissue. Okay, pwede siyang good soil for a deposition of scar tissue, right? So suppurative of purulent inflammation, pus or purulent exudate. Remember your neutrophils, debris, and edema. So suppurative, no, purulent, may pus. Okay, and then suppurative inflammation can be localized, so in the form of abscess formation. And lastly, your ulcers. These are local defect on the surface of an organ or tissue produced by sloughing, shedding of inflammatory necrotic tissue. So ito, serous inflammation. This is marked by exudation of cell-poor fluid into the spaces created by cell injury or into the body cavities, right? Typically, the fluid in serous inflammation is not infected by destructive organisms or does not contain large number of leukocytes kasi nga cell-poor fluid siya, right? So ito yung example natin, a bullous disease, no? Next is your fibrinous inflammation. Again, as I mentioned earlier, ito yung ano sabihin ko? Itong na-mention ko kanina na can be a breeding ground for the further deposition of scar tissue in fibrinous inflammation. Okay, fibrin is formed and deposited in the extracellular space. So the fibrin would appear as a pink homogeneous, no, material on H&E. All right. And remember also that fibrinous exudate is characteristic inflammation in the lining of the body cavity, such as meninges, pericardium, and pleura. Tandaan nyo yan, ha? All right. And it develops when the vascular leaks are large or there is a local procoagulant stimulus, such as your cancer cells. So here's an example of fibrinous inflammation, no? Fibrinous exudates may be dissolved by fibrinolysis and created by macrophages. However, in cases na hindi talaga siya na-remove, okay, over time, ayun sabi ko, it will stimulate ingrowth of fibroblasts and blood vessels, leading to scarring of tissue. All right. So kaya kailangan bantayan ito kasi mag-scar yung tissue natin kung sakaling hindi siya naagapan. So this is an example of your fibrinous pericarditis. Notice the yellowish on the surface of the epicardium, all right? Yan, this one. Parang inisip ka namin, ano kaya ito? Parang something, you know? Pero anyway, kunin mo na lang yung slide. I mean, pag in-scrape mo ito, you will see fibrinous pericarditis as manifested by pink homogeneous material on H&E. Such as this one. Ayan, all right. So purulent or suppurative inflammation naman is characterized by the production of pus, an exudate consisting of neutrophils, liquefied debris, necrotic cells, and edema fluid. Now, there is such a term as a localized purulent inflammation and is known as your abscess. So localized collection ito. Okay, ng ng neutrophils and the necrotic debris. These are your abscesses, right? So most of the suppurative is also caused by your also, although liquefactive necrosis din, no, usually secondary to pyogenic bacteria such as your staphylococcus. So on gross examination, they appear as tan yellow, no? Tapos minsan nag-ooze pag freshly cut ba siya. Pag piniga mo yan yung mga abscess natin, para talaga siyang nana, no? Okay. All right. So this is an example of your supurative purulent inflammation. This abscess, no? If you could be able to see this under the microscope using the scanner view, tapos makikita mo na ganyan diffuse amplification, diffuse yung growth pattern ng neutrophils. So I would suggest an acute inflammation. Although there are chronic cells, no, we have lymphocytes, pero yung majority of the abscess actually is ano tawag ko? Diyos ko, nawala ako. Majority of the abscess is actually as long as na incision and drainage, managed by incision and drainage. Ibig sabihin, yung ngada ko, ihiwao na sa and then i-drain yung fluid na yun. Kasi kung hindi yan madi-drain, hindi talaga yan lalo pag malaki yung hubag, okay? Hindi talaga yan maaayos or hindi talaga yan magre-resolve kasi magbubukol yan, mag-granulation tissue yan in the long run. So merong disfigurement pag hindi siya na-incise tsaka nakuha ang na. Alright? Yung pag-localize yung abscess. However, pag mga localized abscess or localized inflammation or abscess na maliliit lang, pwede lang yan, pwede siyang tirisin. Okay? O pwede siyang hayaan lang. Alright? Lastly, this is your ulcer, no? This is a excavation of the mucosal lining. Alright? Yan. Actually, the ulceration, ito yung lining epithelium. At the same time, ito yung areas ng ulcer formation. This is a form of acute inflammation, no? Yung ulceration natin. We have layers din dyan. Merong fibrosis, fibrotic layer, merong area of neutrophils, infiltrate. Yun. And then also, there are some neovascularization near the viable lining epithelium. Now, remember that the acute inflammation, it will not go on for as long as nabubuhay yung tao na acute inflammation. It will come to 3 lang naman talaga yan. Pero ito yung kasi nakasulat sa natin. Ito yung fate ng acute inflammation natin. First is there complete resolution. So pwede yung inciting agent natanggal na or na-remove na efficiently or successfully by the body. So therefore, there is complete resolution of the acute inflammation. Sometimes meron pa din abscess formation in the long run, no? And lastly, meron siyang third, no, we have fibrosis. So usually after substantial tissue destruction, syempre kung may excavation na dyan or may yuhob na ba sa area, for example sa kamay, magfa-fibrosis yan. At the same time, pwede siyang mag-lay down ng collagen, mga activated fibroblasts, no, angiogenesis, etc. Para makapag-produce tayo ng substantial tissue destruction. At the same time, pwede din kasi itong as part of the healing process yung fibrosis, kasi yung scar natin, it's actually a form of fibrosis yun. Okay, and after abundant, yung sinabi ko, after abundant fibrin exudation, especially in serous cavities such as in pleural peritoneum, they can undergo fibrous pericarditis or fibrous pleuritis, all right? Or fibrinous, ganun. And next is your progression to chronic inflammation. So ito yung mga outcomes ng acute inflammation natin. Complete resolution, fibrosis, progression to chronic inflammation. So ito yung picture natin, no? So pag may injury, yan, acute inflammation can form or yung fate niya is can either proceed with the chronic inflammation. So at least meron continuum ba kung sakali. At least may history, may acute inflammation niyan. So hindi na agapan, so na-progress into chronic inflammation. And aside from that, it will be completely resolved, no, as long as the injured stimuli is cleared na talaga and no medications na siya or very minimal na yung medications, and there is replacement of injured cells, and now there is normal function, no? Yung function is wala na siya, hindi na siya manifested. All right, and also yan pus formation, abscess formation that can be at the same time healing. Yung pinaka gusto natin dito is either resolution or healing, no? Healing kasi although may some degree of loss of function din kasi fibrosis na siya eh. For example, sa joints, for example, ha. So medyo limited na yung movement ng joints kung sakali nandun yung fibrosis. Somehow, no? At least merong a little bit of dysfunctionality, all right?